Some promises refuse to die, even when everyone believes they already have. The old German Shepherd sat alone behind a chain-link fence at the county police K-9 retirement adoption fair just outside Norfolk, Virginia, while families wandered past without slowing their steps. Children laughed near the food trucks, balloons drifted lazily beneath a bright September sky, and retired handlers exchanged quiet stories over steaming cups of coffee, but nobody stopped in front of kennel number 12. The shepherd was older now. His once powerful frame leaned beneath a weathered sable coat touched with silver around the muzzle. One ear carried a tiny notch left by years no one there could explain, and his amber eyes never begged for attention. They simply watched, calm, patient, as though waiting for someone who had been terribly late. 7-year-old Sophie Bennett noticed him long before anyone else did. She tugged gently on her father's sleeve, nearly spilling the lemonade she had been carrying. "Daddy, can I buy that police dog?" she whispered, her voice so soft it almost disappeared beneath the cheerful chatter surrounding them. Her father smiled apologetically. "Sweetheart, retired police dogs aren't toys. They need special care." Sophie didn't answer. She only kept staring into the shepherd's eyes. The dog slowly stood, every movement deliberate, neither excited nor fearful. He walked to the front of the kennel and rested his head quietly against the fence, looking not at the little girl, but somewhere beyond her shoulder. Ethan Mercer had been standing 20 feet away studying a display of military working dog equipment, hoping the outing might distract him from another sleepless week. At 37, the former Navy SEAL still carried himself with the quiet balance of a man trained to notice everything without appearing to notice anything at all. His broad shoulders remained strong despite retirement. His light brown hair was cut short in the old military habit, and faint lines around his pale face hinted at years spent carrying memories heavier than any rucksack. He turned only because Sophie had spoken loudly enough for the words to drift across the crowd. His eyes followed the direction of her tiny finger until they settled on the shepherd. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the dog stepped closer to the fence. Hanging beneath the faded leather collar was an old brass identification tag that caught a single beam of afternoon sunlight. Ethan's breathing stopped. The world around him seemed to fade beneath the distant sound of children laughing and flags snapping gently in the coastal breeze. His eyes locked onto the worn metal tag, as if every year between then and now had suddenly vanished. Scratched deeply into the weathered surface was a name. Valor. Beneath it, almost erased by time, were two smaller words Ethan prayed he would never see again. Operation Black Tide. His hands trembled before he realized they were moving. Color drained from his face. That tag had disappeared years ago on a mission that had never officially existed. It could not be here. It should not exist. Yet the old shepherd never looked away. He simply stood in complete silence, his steady amber eyes fixed on Ethan with the unmistakable patience of someone who had finally found the person he had spent years waiting to bring home. Ethan did not hear the voices around him anymore. The laughter of children, the cheerful conversations between retired officers, even the distant barking of younger police dogs faded into a dull murmur beneath the weight of a memory he had spent 12 long years trying to bury. His fingers hovered inches from the rusted tag, but never touched it. Somehow, touching it would make everything real again. Valor remained perfectly still. The old German shepherd neither wagged his tail nor whimpered. He simply watched Ethan with the quiet patience of an old soldier waiting for his commanding officer to remember the mission. Sophie looked up at her father, then back toward Ethan. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is that man crying?" Her father glanced over and noticed the former Navy SEAL standing motionless before the kennel. Ethan had not even realized a tear had escaped until it landed on the dusty concrete below. He quickly brushed it away, embarrassed by an emotion he had not allowed himself in years. The volunteer overseeing the adoption event approached with a warm smile. She appeared to be in her early 60s, wearing a navy blue polo embroidered with the County K-9 Retirement Foundation. "You know him?" she asked softly, following Ethan's gaze toward the shepherd. Ethan swallowed before answering. I think I used to." The woman nodded gently. "He arrived about 8 months ago after another department retired him. Nobody knows much about his military years. The records were incomplete. They only sent the collar and the identification tag with him." Ethan stared at the worn leather collar. Every crack in its surface looked older than it should have been, yet somehow it had survived time better than he had. "Has anyone ever tried removing the tag?" he asked quietly. "Several times," the volunteer replied. "The strange thing is that he becomes anxious whenever someone unclips it." The veterinarian finally decided to leave it where it belonged. "It seems to comfort him." Ethan closed his eyes for only a second. In another lifetime, during another mission, he had personally fastened that tag onto a young German shepherd whose training had already amazed every handler on the base. Valor had not been the fastest dog. He had not been the biggest either. But he possessed something impossible to teach. He never forgot a scent. He never abandoned an assignment. Most of all, he never left anyone behind. The memory struck with painful clarity. A dusty training field near Coronado. A younger Ethan kneeling beside an eager shepherd whose oversized paws betrayed his youth. "Good boy, Valor." He had laughed while clipping the brass tag onto the fresh leather collar. "Now everyone knows who you are." The image disappeared as quickly as it had come. Ethan opened his eyes to find the old dog still staring at him exactly the same way. Not with excitement. Not even with recognition. There was something deeper in those amber eyes. Relief. As though an endless watch had finally reached its end. Slowly, Valor lifted one weathered paw and rested it against the bottom of the kennel gate. No barking. No scratching. Just that single silent gesture. Sophie quietly slipped away from her father and walked closer until she stood beside Ethan. She looked up at him with innocent curiosity before kneeling in front of the shepherd. "It is okay," she whispered to the dog. "I think he remembers you." Valor gently lowered his head, and for the very first time that afternoon, his tired tail gave one slow, careful sweep across the concrete floor. Ethan felt his heartbeat stumble because deep inside, beneath years of discipline and regret, one impossible thought refused to stay silent. If Valor had survived, then perhaps the story he had believed for 12 years had never been the whole truth. The adoption fair slowly returned to its gentle rhythm, but Ethan Mercer remained rooted in front of kennel number 12 as though the years themselves had wrapped invisible chains around his feet. A cool breeze drifted in from the Chesapeake Bay, carrying the scent of salt water, fresh-cut grass, and distant pine. Somewhere nearby, an American flag fluttered above the training field, its steady movement reminding him of mornings that belonged to another life. The volunteer quietly unlatched the kennel gate. "You can go inside if you would like," she said. "He has not shown any aggression toward anyone." Ethan hesitated before stepping across the threshold. The concrete floor felt strangely familiar beneath his boots. Valor did not rush toward him. Instead, the aging German shepherd slowly closed the short distance between them until only inches remained. His muzzle lifted toward Ethan's hand, breathing in carefully, patiently, almost reverently. Ethan finally reached forward. His fingers rested against the shepherd's weathered neck, brushing through coarse sable fur that had once been thick and glossy. Valor closed his eyes for a brief moment and released a slow, tired breath that sounded less like relief and more like the end of a journey. Ethan's throat tightened. "You always did that," he whispered almost to himself. "Every mission. You checked my scent before we moved." The old shepherd gently leaned against his leg without making a sound. Sophie watched through the open gate, her small hands folded beneath her chin. "He remembers," she whispered. Her father looked down at her with a soft smile. "Maybe they both do." Ethan lowered himself onto one knee. His gaze returned to the brass tag hanging beneath the faded collar. Years of scratches had worn away most of its shine, but one small engraving remained visible beneath the operation name. It was not an official military marking. It was a tiny hand-carved star in the lower right corner. Ethan's heartbeat stumbled again. He remembered carving that imperfect little star himself with the tip of a pocket knife while waiting for a transport flight after Valor completed his certification. He had laughed at how crooked it looked. "Nobody else will ever notice," he had told the young dog while scratching behind his ears. "But I will always know it is yours." No government record could have reproduced that tiny mark. No replacement tag could have copied it. This was the original, which meant the impossible had somehow survived. Ethan carefully turned the tag over. On the back, nearly hidden beneath years of wear, were faint initials he had never seen before. 2 letters. TH. His breathing became shallow. Thomas Hayes. The name surfaced from memory like something rising through deep water. Chief Petty Officer Thomas Hayes had been his closest teammate, the man who believed every mission deserved a second chance and every dog deserved to come home. 12 years earlier, after Operation Black Tide ended in confusion and silence, Thomas had officially been listed among those who never returned. Valor had disappeared the very same day. Ethan had spent countless nights believing he had failed them both. Yet someone had engraved those initials after Ethan attached the tag. Someone who had held Valor one final time. Someone who wanted a message to survive even if no words ever could. Valor slowly turned his head toward the parking lot instead of looking at Ethan. His ears lifted with surprising focus despite his age. Then, without hesitation, the old shepherd began walking toward the open kennel gate. After 3 slow steps, he stopped, glanced back over his shoulder, and waited. Not wandering, not exploring, waiting, as though an unfinished assignment had quietly resumed the very moment Ethan walked back into his life. The volunteer opened the final page of the adoption paperwork and placed it gently on the folding table beneath the shade of a white canvas tent. Families continued strolling between the kennels, unaware that something far more important than an adoption had quietly begun. Ethan never took his eyes off Valor. The old German shepherd remained standing near the gate, watching him with calm certainty, as though the next decision already belonged to both of them. "There is no adoption fee today," the volunteer said with a kind smile. "Our sponsors cover the cost for retired service dogs. We only ask one thing." Ethan looked up. "What is that?" "Promise that he will spend whatever time he has left knowing he belongs somewhere." Ethan lowered his head, unable to answer immediately. Belonging. It was a simple word, yet one he had not truly felt himself since leaving military service. Sophie stepped beside him and slipped her small hand into his. "He already belongs with you," she said quietly. "You both have the same eyes." Ethan smiled faintly for the first time that afternoon. "What kind of eyes are those?" Sophie thought for a moment before answering. "The kind that miss somebody." Her innocent honesty settled over the moment like a gentle prayer. Ethan looked back toward Valor. The shepherd slowly walked closer until his shoulder rested lightly against Ethan's knee. There was no excitement in the gesture, only quiet trust. It was the same silent contact Valor had always used before missions, as though reminding his partner that neither of them would face the unknown alone. Ethan signed the adoption papers with a hand that still trembled slightly. As the ink dried across the page, the volunteer unclipped the temporary identification band from Valor's collar, leaving only the old brass tag resting against the weathered leather. "He never liked wearing anything else," she said softly. "Now I understand why." Moments later, they stepped beyond the fairgrounds into the parking lot. The afternoon sun had begun drifting lower, painting long golden shadows across rows of parked trucks and family cars. Ethan opened the rear door of his pickup, expecting to help the aging shepherd climb inside. Instead, Valor ignored the truck completely. He turned toward the far edge of the parking lot, where a narrow walking trail disappeared beneath tall oak trees. He stood there without moving, ears lifted, nose testing the breeze. Then he looked back at Ethan. Not impatiently, expectantly. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. The trail led toward an older section of the county park where abandoned training fields and storage buildings had once been used decades earlier. According to the signs, most of them had been closed for years. "Interesting," Ethan murmured. "You have somewhere else in mind." Sophie noticed it too. "He wants to show you something." Her father chuckled gently. "Maybe he just wants a walk." But Ethan knew better. During every deployment, Valor had communicated the same way. No barking unless necessary. No wasted movement. Every glance had purpose. Every pause meant wait. Every step meant follow. The old shepherd started walking down the shaded path at an easy pace, occasionally glancing over his shoulder to make certain Ethan remained behind him. Dry leaves whispered beneath his paws while shafts of afternoon sunlight filtered through the branches above, filling the quiet trail with dancing patches of gold. Ethan adjusted the strap of the small bag containing the adoption documents and followed without another word. Deep inside, an old instinct awakened after years of silence. This no longer felt like an ordinary afternoon. It felt like the beginning of a mission. And somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the trees and buried beneath 12 years of unanswered questions, Valor seemed absolutely certain that something was still waiting to be found. The narrow trail curved gently through towering oaks whose branches filtered the late afternoon sunlight into long ribbons of gold across the ground. Fallen leaves softened every footstep, and the distant cries of gulls drifting inland blended with the rustling canopy overhead. Valor never hurried. His aging body moved with measured confidence, conserving every ounce of strength as though each step had been planned long before this day arrived. Ethan followed several yards behind, watching the old German shepherd with the same careful attention he had once reserved for teammates during reconnaissance patrols. Sophie skipped quietly beside them, occasionally reaching down to gather smooth acorns or colorful leaves, somehow sensing that even her cheerful curiosity belonged in whispers here. After nearly a quarter-mile, the paved walking path faded into an older gravel road bordered by weathered wooden fences. Beyond them stood a forgotten storage yard where several maintenance sheds rested beneath decades of climbing ivy. Most windows were covered with faded plywood, and a rusted chain hung loosely across a gate that no longer seemed to guard anything important. Valor stopped without warning. His ears lifted. His nose sampled the cool breeze for several silent seconds before he turned left toward the smallest building near the back corner of the property. Ethan noticed the faded county emblem still visible above its peeling door. Years ago, before newer facilities had been built, retired K-9 equipment had reportedly been stored there. He had almost forgotten hearing that during a joint training exercise many years earlier. Valor approached the building but did not scratch at the door. Instead, he walked slowly around the outside wall, his amber eyes studying every weathered board as though comparing them to a memory only he could still see. Then he stopped beside an old rain barrel covered in moss. He lowered his head, sniffed once, and looked directly at Ethan. Nothing happened. The dog simply waited. Ethan stepped closer. The barrel itself appeared ordinary, but beside it rested a flat limestone marker almost completely hidden beneath leaves and creeping vines. He knelt and brushed the debris away with the palm of his hand. Beneath the dirt, faint carved letters slowly emerged. Building 12. K-9 Archives. Closed. The date beneath the inscription was 12 years old. Ethan frowned. Archives, he murmured. I thought everything had been transferred years ago. Sophie crouched beside him. Maybe they forgot something. Ethan almost smiled. Adults often overlooked the simplest possibility because it seemed too obvious. Valor quietly walked 3 more steps until he reached a section of the wooden wall where one faded blue shutter hung slightly crooked. Again, he neither barked nor pawed at it. He only looked at Ethan with calm certainty before glancing back toward the shutter. The gesture was unmistakable. Follow this clue. Ethan carefully pushed the loose shutter aside. Behind it, hidden from casual view, was a small brass hook mounted beneath the window frame. Hanging from the hook was an old metal key attached to a weathered leather strip darkened by time. Dust covered both, yet neither had fallen despite years of wind and rain. Sophie gasped softly. He knew it was there. Ethan lifted the key into the fading sunlight. It was old enough that its engraved number had nearly disappeared, but one detail remained perfectly clear. Stamped into the handle was the same tiny hand-carved star he had placed on Valor's identification tag years before. His pulse quickened. No one else knew about that crooked little star. No official inventory would have carried it. Someone Ethan had trusted had left this key here intentionally, believing that one day only the right dog would remember where to find it, and only the right man would understand what it meant. The old brass key felt unexpectedly warm in Ethan's hand despite spending years hidden beneath dust and weathered wood. He turned it over once more, tracing the tiny crooked star with his thumb as memories continued surfacing one quiet piece at a time. Thomas Hayes had carved the same imperfect symbol into his own coffee mug during training, joking that straight lines belonged to engineers, not sailors. Ethan had laughed and copied the mark onto Valor's tag and, apparently, onto this key. It had become an unspoken signature shared only between friends. Valor stepped toward the weathered storage building and stopped beside a narrow steel door tucked beneath the sagging roofline. Ivy covered most of the faded paint, and a small brass lock hung untouched, its surface dulled by years of rain and salt air drifting inland from the coast. Ethan slid the key into the lock without expecting it to fit. It turned smoothly on the first attempt. The quiet click echoed through the still afternoon like the final sentence of a story waiting years to be spoken aloud. Sophie held her breath as the heavy door slowly opened inward. A cool scent of cedar, old paper, and machine oil drifted into the fading sunlight. Dust floated lazily through thin beams of golden light filtering between wooden slats high above. The room was much smaller than Ethan expected. Shelves lined both walls, filled with faded training binders, retired equipment cases, worn leather leashes, and neatly labeled storage boxes that had remained untouched for years. Nothing appeared valuable. Nothing looked extraordinary. Yet Valor walked directly past every shelf without hesitation. His pace remained slow but certain until he reached an old green military footlocker resting beneath a workbench at the back of the room. The shepherd lowered himself beside it and quietly placed one paw against the weathered lid. Then he looked up at Ethan. No bark, no whine, only patient certainty. Ethan knelt beside the footlocker. Its metal corners were scratched with age, and a faded shipping label had almost completely peeled away. Across the front, someone had written a single name in black marker years earlier. Hayes. Ethan's chest tightened. His fingertips rested against the cold latch for several long seconds before he finally lifted it. Inside lay a carefully folded American flag, preserved inside a protective cloth cover. Beneath it rested a waterproof journal, an aging digital camera sealed inside a transparent pouch, a silver Navy insignia wrapped in soft fabric, and a plain white envelope with Ethan's name written neatly across the front in unmistakable handwriting. He stared without moving. Every item had been arranged with deliberate care, as though someone believed they would eventually be found exactly like this. Sophie looked at the envelope but never reached toward it. Even at 7 years old, she sensed it belonged to a conversation much older than herself. Ethan slowly picked it up. The paper had yellowed around the edges, yet the seal remained unbroken. Tucked beneath the envelope was one final object that stole the little breath he still had. It was a simple canvas dog toy shaped like a small training bumper, faded almost white after years of use. Valor gently nudged it with his nose before looking back at Ethan. During every deployment, Thomas had carried that little bumper in his pack because Valor refused to end a training day without retrieving it one last time. Ethan remembered teasing him that the dog probably loved the toy more than either of them. Thomas had simply smiled and answered, "Sometimes the smallest things help someone find their way home." As silence settled over the forgotten room, Ethan finally understood that nothing inside the footlocker had been hidden to preserve the past. It had been protected to complete a promise. And for 12 patient years, one faithful German shepherd had quietly guarded the path until the right hands were finally ready to open it. Its seal cracked with the softest whisper, a sound almost too small to carry the weight of 12 lost years. Ethan unfolded the single sheet of paper with hands that no longer obeyed the steady discipline they once had. The handwriting was unmistakable, strong, careful, and slightly slanted to the right. Thomas Hayes had always written as though every word deserved its own place in the world. Ethan began reading in silence while the fading afternoon light spilled through the dusty windows. Dear Ethan, if you are holding this letter, then our stubborn partner finally finished the assignment I asked him to keep. That means 2 miracles happened. First, Valor survived. Second, you did too. If both of those things came true, then God was kinder to us than we ever expected. Ethan stopped reading for a moment, his vision blurring. Valor quietly rested beside him, the old shepherd's head leaning gently against his boot, as though he had heard these words 1,000 times without ever needing to read them. Ethan continued, I know you will spend years blaming yourself for what happened, because that is who you are. You always carried responsibility heavier than your own pack. So let me save you one last time. Nobody betrayed anyone. Nobody abandoned the mission. The choice was mine. You argued to stay. I ordered you to leave because one of us had to bring our people home. I also knew you would never willingly walk away if Valor stayed beside me. So I sent him after you. He obeyed my command for exactly 30 seconds before turning around. That dog has always listened to his heart more than to any handler. Ethan closed his eyes as another memory surfaced. Valor had broken formation only once during training, racing back across an obstacle course because a younger recruit had twisted his ankle. Everyone laughed afterward, except Thomas, who simply scratched the dog's ears and said, He does not follow commands. He protects family. Ethan had forgotten those words until now. He looked back down at the letter. When Valor found me again, I realized something important. He had already chosen both of us. So I gave him one final job. Guard everything that tells the truth until Ethan is ready to believe it. Dogs do not measure time the way we do. They measure promises. If he is standing beside you now, then he never stopped keeping his. Ethan's breathing grew uneven. The years of quiet guilt that had settled inside him like winter frost began to loosen one fragile piece at a time. Sophie sat quietly across from him, watching without speaking. She could not read the letter from where she sat, yet she somehow understood that something invisible was healing in front of her. Ethan carefully reached into the footlocker and lifted the waterproof camera. Its battery was long dead, but inside the pouch rested a small memory card preserved against moisture and time. Beneath it lay the weathered journal. Opening the first page, he found dozens of handwritten entries, not mission reports, but ordinary moments. Thomas had written about sunrise over the ocean during training, about Sophie-sized stray kittens that wandered onto the base, about the way Valor insisted on carrying his own leash whenever he could. One entry simply read, "If anything ever happens to me, tell Ethan he was the best partner I could have asked for. Tell him to forgive himself before he grows old." Ethan lowered the journal onto his lap and covered his face for a long moment. No tears fell quickly. They arrived slowly, quietly, like rain after a season of drought. Valor responded exactly as he always had. The old German shepherd leaned closer until his shoulder rested firmly against Ethan's side, offering silent comfort instead of seeking it. Sophie smiled through misty eyes and whispered so softly it almost disappeared into the still room. "He waited all this time because he knew you would come." Ethan looked down at the faithful shepherd whose amber eyes remained warm despite the passing years. For the first time since Operation Black Tide, he no longer saw a reminder of everything he had lost. He saw the living proof that love, loyalty, and truth could outlast fear, silence, and time itself. The little storage room remained silent except for the gentle creak of old wooden beams settling with the evening air. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent, spilling warm amber light through the dusty windows until every floating speck seemed suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. Ethan carefully folded Thomas's letter along its original crease before placing it back inside the envelope with the same respect someone might offer a family photograph. For years he had believed that healing required answers. Now he understood it required acceptance. Valor slowly rose to his feet and stretched with the quiet dignity of an old warrior whose final burden had finally become lighter. His movements were slower than they had been that morning, yet there was peace in them now. The tension that had quietly lived behind his amber eyes since Ethan first saw him at the adoption fair seemed to soften into something almost joyful. Sophie stepped closer and gently wrapped both arms around the German shepherd's neck. Valor lowered his head just enough for the little girl to reach him comfortably, then rested his muzzle against her shoulder with complete trust. "He looks happier," she whispered. Ethan smiled through tired eyes. "I think he has been waiting to hear someone say the mission is finally over." Sophie looked at him thoughtfully. "Can dogs understand that?" Ethan glanced toward the folded letter before answering. "Maybe not the words, but they always understand love. They always know when someone finally comes home." They gathered the contents of the footlocker carefully. Ethan slipped the journal into his backpack beside the waterproof camera and wrapped the Navy insignia inside the folded American flag before placing everything back into the green case. Nothing felt like evidence anymore. They felt like family treasures that had simply been waiting for the right hands. Before closing the lid, Ethan noticed one final object tucked into a narrow corner beneath the cloth lining. It was a small brass compass no larger than the palm of his hand. The glass was scratched, and the metal had lost its shine, yet the needle still pointed faithfully north. A tiny note rested beneath it in Thomas's familiar handwriting. "For the next journey." Ethan laughed quietly through another wave of emotion. "You always had the last word," he murmured. Valor gently nudged the compass with his nose before looking toward the open doorway where the evening breeze carried the scent of cedar and distant ocean salt into the room. Ethan understood immediately. The old shepherd was no longer leading him toward another hidden clue. He was inviting him outside. Together they stepped into the cooling autumn air. Long shadows stretched across the forgotten storage yard, while golden sunlight painted the ivy-covered walls in soft shades of copper. Birds settled high among the oak branches, and somewhere far beyond the trees a church bell marked the passing hour. Ethan paused beside the doorway and looked back once more at the little building that had quietly protected one man's promise for more than a decade. He gently locked the door again using the old brass key, then returned the key to its hidden hook behind the weathered shutter exactly where Valor had led him to find it. Some things, he realized, were not meant to be possessed. They were meant to be honored. Sophie slipped her hand into Ethan's as they began walking toward the parking lot. Valor moved between them at an easy pace, his head held a little higher than before, his tired tail swaying gently from side to side. No commands were spoken. None were needed. Three souls simply walked together beneath a sky turning shades of gold and blue, each carrying less sorrow than they had only an hour earlier, while the quiet evening seemed to whisper that the longest journeys are not measured in miles, but in the distance between guilt and grace. Several weeks later, the first cool breath of October drifted across Ethan Mercer's small home on the outskirts of Norfolk. The maple trees surrounding the porch had begun exchanging their summer green for quiet shades of amber and crimson, and every morning sunlight spilled gently across the wooden floor where Valor now preferred to sleep. The old German shepherd no longer carried the alert posture of a working dog waiting for another assignment. Instead, he rested peacefully beside the front window, lifting his head only when he heard familiar footsteps approaching. Sophie visited almost every Saturday with her father. She never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes she brought homemade biscuits shaped like little stars. Sometimes she carried a tennis ball she knew Valor no longer had the strength to chase very far. Most days she simply sat beside him, reading children's books aloud while his tired amber eyes remained half-closed, listening more to the sound of her voice than the words themselves. Ethan often watched from the kitchen, a warm cup of coffee resting between his hands. There had been a time when silence inside his home felt heavy enough to echo. Now it sounded different. It sounded like healing. The waterproof camera had eventually revealed its memories after a local photography shop carefully recovered the files from the aging memory card. There were no classified secrets inside, only ordinary moments that somehow meant everything. Thomas laughing while Valor splashed through shallow ocean waves during training. Ethan pretending not to smile as the young German shepherd stubbornly refused to return a worn canvas bumper. A sunrise over the Pacific with three long shadows stretching across the sand. Looking at those photographs, Ethan realized something he had overlooked for years. Their greatest memories had never happened during extraordinary missions. They had happened between them, in the ordinary moments when friendship quietly became family. The journal and Thomas's letter found a permanent place inside a handcrafted wooden box resting on Ethan's bookshelf. Above it hung the old brass identification tag beside a framed photograph of Valor in his younger days, ears tall, eyes bright, standing proudly between two smiling friends. The tiny crooked star still caught the morning light each day, reminding Ethan that even imperfect marks could become lasting symbols of love. One peaceful afternoon, as golden leaves drifted lazily across the yard, Ethan carried a comfortable blanket onto the porch. Valor slowly followed, settling beside the rocking chair with a grateful sigh. Sophie climbed onto the chair beside Ethan and leaned gently against his arm. They watched the breeze carry leaves across the grass without speaking for a long while. Finally, Sophie looked toward the old shepherd. "Do you think he knows he finished his promise?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled as Valor lifted his head just enough to feel the warmth of the afternoon sun across his face. "I think he always knew," Ethan answered. "Maybe the promise was never only about finding me. Maybe it was about helping me find myself again." At the sound of Ethan's voice, Valor opened his eyes one last time that afternoon and rested his weathered muzzle gently across Ethan's boots exactly as he had done on countless mornings years before. Ethan reached down and slowly stroked the silver around his faithful friend's face. "Welcome home, partner," he whispered with quiet gratitude instead of sorrow. A gentle breeze stirred the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang through the peaceful neighborhood, and sunlight reflected softly from the little brass tag hanging beside the front window. In that quiet moment, nothing miraculous appeared to happen. No voices echoed from the past. No hidden secrets remained to uncover. There was only a man who had found forgiveness, a little girl who had believed kindness could change a life, and an old German shepherd who proved that the truest promises are never measured by the years they take, but by the love that refuses to let them be forgot.